Welcome everyone. My name is Lara Anderson and I'm the Senior Digital and Communications Specialist at the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center. I'm so excited that we could bring you this great event to talk about our new report produced in partnership with the Harvard Labor and Worklife Program. As the US shifts towards cleaner technologies and away from fossil fuels, important questions arise about the impact of this transition on workers. How can we ensure that the transition leads to high-quality jobs in emerging clean energy industries, that the workers in fossil fuel industries are treated fairly, and that the benefits of the transition are equitable? A number of scholars and activists have proposed solutions that address climate change while also supporting workers and increasing economic justice. Our new report, A Role for State Attorneys General in a Just Transition, explores these issues with a focus specifically on what AGs can do in relation to the upcoming transition to clean energy. The report provides an overview of AG powers and enforcement activity on labor and the environment, and then offers a series of ideas and options for state AGs interested in playing a role in driving a more just transition. We'll dive more into the report a little bit later, but first, a few logistics. We'll start with opening remarks from Dana Johnson and Lara Skinner, and then hear from Bethany Davis Noll and Terri Gerstein, the authors of the report. We'll save some time at the end for audience questions. The chat is closed, but you can put your questions in the Q&A, and they won't be visible to other audience members. Now I'd like to introduce our opening speakers for today's event. I'll keep the bios short, but I encourage you to read more about them at the link in the chat. Dana Johnson serves as Senior Director of Strategy and Federal Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice, where she leads an advocacy, regulatory, and policy setting team. She has successfully helped shape the environmental industry narrative in the areas of clean air, healthy homes, water quality, energy democracy, and transportation standards. And we're so grateful for her service on our advisory council. Dr. Lara Skinner is the Director of the Worker Institute's Labor Leading on Climate program and the director of the new Climate Jobs Institute at Cornell. Dr. Skinner studies the labor and employment impacts of climate protection, clean energy, and just transition. She also provides training and education programs for unions to help union leaders and members engage in public debates and decision-making around climate protection and clean energy. Thank you both for being here today. I'm going to get things started with a two-part question. First, please tell us more about your work in relation to the issue of jobs in this transitional economy. And second, please tell us what you think are the most important factors to consider when policymakers, advocates, and AGs look at the issue of climate change and jobs in a transitioning economy. Dana, I'll turn it over to you first, and then you can pass it on to Lara.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to share today. I want to start off by sharing a little bit about We Act for Environmental Justice. We are a Northern Manhattan-based environmental justice organization that really works to ensure that healthy communities are built by having people of color and people in areas of low income participate in a meaningful way in the decisions that get made around policies and practices within the public health and environmental arenas. And I consider economic development to be one of those areas that are important for determining a community's health. We also convene a network of environmental justice organizations. They represent a little over 20 states that are red, blue, purple. So along the political spectrum, they are communities that are cities, suburban areas, as well as rural areas. So we really have a diverse group of 50 organizations that are, our focus is supporting them in linking the work that they do to policy making that gets done at the federal level. And so for We Act, since 2012, we have had a workforce development training program and trained more than 2,000 unemployed and underemployed men and women of color in the construction arena. Um, our goal was really to overcome barriers to access while also providing economic opportunities. And the trainings were in like OSHA safety, solar installation, BPI training, flagging, and scaffolding. We also did this work in partnership with Solar One and the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. And as a result, we have been able to install solar panels at 13 buildings, 11 of them being Housing Development Fund corporations in Northern Manhattan, and really brought economic relief to communities. In the first year, there was a $61,000 of saving in energy bills as a related to that project, and that is was expected to increase over time. But we also estimate that there were more than 800 pounds of NOx emissions relief. So the work that we were doing was really focused on improving air quality in communities. And then as a result of our program, 10 of the participants formed a worker cooperative that is called the Northern Manhattan Solar Cooperative. And today they go around New York City and New York State and bid on solar installation projects. And so, we think about workforce development. We also think about entrepreneurship when it comes to our clean energy transition, and really working to ensure that people in environmental justice communities get to participate in it in a meaningful way. So in December 2020, we released a Green Jobs Report that looked at the impact of our transition to a green economy on people living in an environmental justice community, and wanted to make some recommendations on what could be done to ensure that no set of Americans were left behind in that process. And I'll just say broadly, we wanted to look at the employment impacts. So we thought that there would be 4.2 to 4.6 million jobs created each year between 2020 and 2050 as a result of this, our energy transition. But at the same time, between 2021 and 2030, and then 2031 and 2050, we would see between 12 and 34,000 jobs lost each year, as we moved away from coal and oil and gas industry. So there are quite a few people that we need to make sure are left behind, that there isn't a gig economy created as a result, and that there were, important protections as people moved from one industry to the other. So just really quickly, some of the best practices that we uplifted in that report were, continuing to make resources available for, OSHA and other certifications. We needed to provide wraparound services that spanned from, providing transportation to mentoring opportunities and relationships, tutoring in areas that required a higher skill set, like math and science. We wanted to connect. We thought it was important to connect companies with industries. And we did think it was important to build stronger relationships between unions and communities, acknowledging that there is a tough relationship between communities of color and unions. We also tried to think about some of the policy categories that were important. And so it was worker support funds, pension protections, health insurance, creating civic tables where decisions were made together about, how communities would evolve, as well as how workers would be centered in that, addressing environmental damage, repurposing stranded assets, and how do we continue to invest in communities when one area of industry was replaced with another. And in that Green Jobs report, we try to outline some of those things. But I want to wrap up what I'm thinking about in this particular moment as we transition, workers. Um, we have, as I mentioned, a lot of concern around how do we establish a wage that makes it possible for workers to feel comfortable with our transition and have them be protected. And if there were a couple of things that I would recommend um, this audience think about and look at, one is the Department of Labor has developed an equity action plan. Each agency and department was required to do that as part of the executive orders that President Biden released at the start of his tenure. And one of the things that the Department of Labor is focused on is leveraging the partnerships that it has with state and local governments and doing work sector by sector to really ensure that place-based enforcement happens. And so I think that there are opportunities for AGs to connect with Department of Labor regional offices to participate in that process, to really, monitor and engage in forensic activities on the data to be sure that there aren't any violations happening with workers, and that informing, ensuring that workers are informed and aware of policies and practices that affect them, are actually being carried out in the way that is designed. And one way to do that is the Department of Labor will oftentimes talk about the unique relationships that it has with community-based organizations. It will regularly convene conversations at the local and the regional level, and any opportunity to advance those conversations in partnership with one another would be really important and critical. The last thing I'll offer is, if I was to offer an example of a state or a AG office that I think has an interesting program, the District of Columbia in 2021 released a workplace rights grant program where they would use those resources to engage in like awareness and education programs through community-based organizations. I think establishing that kind of program, or enhancing a program if you have one, would be really awesome. Plugging into workforce development programs like we have at WEACT, where you could actually be like a module or a part of the agenda that works to build awareness among communities about labor laws and labor standards, especially when it comes to some of the tax credits, the parameters that are coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, could be really important and really critical. And I think, quite frankly, it will signal to workers in areas where there is concern about protection of rights, that your office is, watching and wanting to ensure that all constituents are protected. So I will drop a link to our Green Jobs report in the chat so that you can dig into it a little bit. And then I will turn it over to you, Lara, for comment.
All right, thank you so much, Dana. And thank you, Terri and the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center. It's really great to be here with you all today for the launch of this exciting new report. As was mentioned earlier, my name is Lara Skinner. I direct the Labor Leading on Climate, soon to be Climate Jobs Institute, which we're launching on January 25th of 2023 here at the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. So we're a state labor school that is dedicated to reversing inequality and improving the lives of working people. And we've been doing this work since the late 1940s. For the Climate Jobs Institute and the Labor Leading on Climate program, Our mission is to guide the nation's transition to a strong, equitable, and resilient clean energy economy that tackles the climate crisis at the scale and pace that we need to, that creates high-quality union jobs, that confronts race and gender inequality, and builds a diverse and inclusive clean energy workforce. And as was mentioned in my bio, for the past 10 years, we have studied the labor and employment impacts of climate change to understand how jobs, economic sectors, and workers will be impacted by climate change and this transition to a climate-friendly economy. We also design what we call worker and equity-centered climate policy, and then we act as a direct resource to the labor movement by providing technical assistance, research and policy support, and by designing and delivering educational programs for both labor leaders and members about climate change and this transition. And then I'd say that we also focus on the intersection of workforce development and equity, and we're very focused on ensuring that we build strong pathways between frontline environmental justice communities, union careers, and the diverse and inclusive clean energy workforce and economy that we need to build. And the other thing I would mention that's important to the work that we're doing right now and what we sort of see is like needed in this moment is that we are the academic and educational partner to the Climate Jobs National Resource Center. And through that partnership, we provide support to coalitions of unions and their allies in about 14 different states to help them develop their own plans for tackling climate change, creating good union jobs, protecting and supporting workers in the existing energy economy, and then also addressing historic inequities. So we call these plans climate jobs plans, and we help coalitions in different states build their own sort of climate job blueprint or plan for the state, and then also build organizations that help advance these plans. And we've helped set up coalitions in 6 states so far, and we're working in a bunch more states over the coming year. So that's just a little bit of background on me and the work that we do. In terms of today's discussion, I believe this issue of just transition is just so incredibly important, and I'm thrilled about the launch of the new report and this webinar, and the focus on, how AG offices in particular can help with the issue of facilitating a just transition. I would offer just some kind of background comments based on the work that we do that I think helps sort of set the context for some of the issues that we're trying to address in this conversation around just transition. One, and I think this is fairly obvious, but this is a monumental and historic transition involving every sector of our economy that we're going through. It's going to cause significant change and disruption in a number of sectors, including job and economic loss. I mean, that's just a reality. We've already seen it, and we're going to see more of it. And this transition from a high carbon economy to a low carbon one touches every sector, right? It's the energy sector, it's the transportation sector, it's buildings, it's industry, manufacturing, agriculture, public and service sector. And we've seen this already, and we continue to see it, right? It requires fundamental change in how we produce and consume things. And it's just a big historic change. And we know that it's going to create a lot of jobs. Most estimates are that it's going to create between 15 and 25 million jobs in this decade. So we know there's going to be a lot of new work, a lot of new jobs that are created as we ramp up our efforts to address climate change. We also know that it has and will cause job loss in some sectors, and as some sectors are phased out and shifted. So that's just one thing, just to this is a really big historic change that we're trying to go through. The second thing I would say is transition is not easy, particularly in this country, particularly in the US. We have had a number of other transitions in this country in the past, and most all of the research and investigation into this shows that they haven't gone that well. So we've had federal and state government programs that have provided support for workers in trade impacted industries like steel. We've had transition support programs for veterans who are returning after war. We've had transition programs specifically targeted to the Pacific Northwest when old growth logging was phased out to support loggers and forest related communities. And in all these cases, the research has shown that the breadth and depth of support that was provided to impacted workers and communities was not sufficient. It didn't reach the full range of workers that were impacted by the transition, and it didn't provide them with the breadth of support that's needed in terms of wages, benefits being replaced, training opportunities, re-education, relocation, right? A variety of things that help facilitate a just transition. The other thing I would say is that the U.S. Is very unique in the sort of challenges it faces in trying to do transition. We've done a lot of educational trips to other parts of the world to understand how transition works. And in the US, our health insurance and our retirement is linked to our employment, right? We don't have, universal healthcare or retirement. And so if you lose your job, you lose all of those critical benefits. And then the other part of it is that unemployment doesn't provide the same level of salary support as you have when you're working. So like that's a very unique challenge that doesn't exist in some other countries. And then the other thing I would say is it's not just about worker support. Like keep in mind that a lot of the facilities or industries that are closed down, they're supporting a whole community. The community's been built around those industries. And so there's a lot of, indirect and induced jobs that are connected to the operations of a facility or plant. And just a lot of sort of economic benefit. The taxes that facilities pay, right, are really important. We worked closely around the closure of the Indian Point nuclear plant, and the union that represented members there was significantly impacted, but lots of other sectors were impacted as well because the plant paid about $20 million a year in taxes to the local community that supported a lot of other activities. So it's a much bigger issue than just the kind of workers that are impacted by the transition. You need a much bigger long-term commitment to helping industries and communities and workers make this transition and find out what's the new alternative, right? What's the new economic activities that are going to replace the ones that have been phased out. There's been some work in the coal region of Germany that's lifted up as one of the best examples of what a big long-term commitment to transition looks like. And then the third thing I would say is that there's a real concern around the quality of jobs in the new clean energy economy that make this just transition difficult. You can't have a just transition if there aren't good, high quality jobs to transition to, right? That's just, that's like fundamental. You've got to have good jobs with good wages and benefits and training opportunities to be able to transition to. So there's issues around the number of jobs, right? And like an example that's often lifted up is, it takes a lot of workers to operate a coal, gas, oil, nuclear plant, right? Just to run that plant. It takes very few workers to run solar and wind farms once they're up and running. So there's an issue around what's the kind of mapping of jobs that are gained and lost in this transition. And how do we maximize job creation and economic development? How do we approach this in a way that's what are the investments that we do will result in the most job creation? I think, offshore wind is a great example. We can construct offshore wind farms. That's going to be great. But will we actually manufacture parts of offshore wind turbines in the US and in specific regions? Will we manufacture towers and blades and nacelles and all of the other component parts that could create a lot of good jobs? The other issue is obviously the quality of jobs. Will these new jobs be good jobs? We're at Cornell, we're currently conducting the first ever study of working conditions in the solar industry in New York State that's being conducted through workers rather than through employers. So most surveys of working conditions are conducted by asking employers about conditions in the industry. We're actually talking to the workers who are doing installations of solar projects. And we want to understand, what are the working conditions like? What is the employment structure? What are the wages? What are the benefits? What are the training opportunities? All of that. And some of you may have seen some recent articles that have come out about, particularly in the residential sector, a lot of solar work being done by temp agency workers and day laborers who are being paid piece rate. They're basically being paid by the number of panels that are being installed per day. And obviously we have a lot of concern around that and the potential hyper exploitation of mostly immigrant workers of color in that type of situation. And the other thing I would say is until recently, very few states have had any standards, wage, training, or job quality standards on clean energy work. It exists for other parts of the economy, but not for clean energy. So this is really key. If we're going to have a just transition, we need to make sure that these new jobs are good, high quality jobs. And if we don't, we're going to significantly exacerbate inequality in the country, of course, if we're creating a bunch of low wage, low quality jobs. And also, I think really importantly, undermine public support too, right? right? That we don't build the levels of support that we want to address climate change if we're not creating good jobs that are benefiting communities, particularly frontline environmental justice communities. And so then the last thing I would say is, just tying this back to our work, we're really helping coalitions of unions in different states develop positive, proactive plans to address the climate crisis and address the climate crisis at the pace and scale that we need to. That's absolutely important. And then also creating high quality union jobs and addressing equity issues. I think all of those things have to be happening at the same time if we're really going to do this work in the way that we need to. And we have coalitions in a number of states, including New York, Illinois, Maine, Rhode Island, and others that have passed bold climate legislation recently. It really scales climate action in the way we need to, but it also puts standards on clean energy work to ensure that these are high quality family and community sustaining jobs. They provide supports to workers who are negatively impacted by the transition and set up new pre-apprenticeship training infrastructure, like, for example, in Illinois, that's coordinated by an equity director at Climate Jobs Illinois that creates that pathway from frontline communities that have been most impacted by climate change, pollution, and historic inequities to high quality training programs with the types of wraparound supports that Dana was mentioning to good careers, long-term careers in the construction industry. So, I think those are like some good examples of where we're moving in this space. New York, Connecticut, Maine, Illinois now have wage training and job quality standards specifically on clean energy work, most of it on work above a certain size. And then, like I said, some states now have support for workers who are negatively impacted by the transition. But again, that's a space where we feel like there's a lot more work that's needed. The programs are not currently providing the depth and breadth of support that's needed. So I'm going to stop there just as some background comments, and I hope that's helpful, and want to say thanks again for including me in this important discussion.
Thank you so much, Dana and Lara, both for those very interesting remarks and also for your incredible work in this area. We really appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to my co-authors on the report, Bethany Davis Noll and Terri Gerstein, to share their ideas on a role for AGs in building a more just transition. First, I'll provide brief bios, but I again encourage you to read more about them at the link in the chat, and we'll also be providing a link to the report. Bethany Davis Noll is our executive director here at the center. She is an adjunct professor at NYU Law and co-chair of the Environmental Law Committee of the New York City Bar Association. She previously served as Assistant Solicitor General in the Office of the New York Attorney General, where she worked on many high-profile cases in the environmental space. Terri Gerstein is the director of the State and Local Enforcement Project at the Harvard Labor and Worklife Program and is a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. Prior to these roles, she worked for over 17 years enforcing labor laws in New York State, including as the Labor Bureau Chief for the New York State AG's office and as Deputy Commissioner in the New York State Department of Labor. I'll hand it over to Bethany and Terri to give an overview of the report and explain what AGs can do to implement some of the recommendations that Dana and Lara just laid out for us.
Thank you, Terri, and thank you, Dana and Lara. That was so wonderful to get us started. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and let's see if I can manage. We're just, okay. So what I want to start with is sort of, oops, did that. Okay, what I want to start with is sort of the genesis of this idea. Terri and I both work with state attorneys general. I work in the energy and environmental space, and she works in the labor space. And as you just heard, there's so many crossover issues. And, Terri will talk more about this, but we've been looking at this idea of just transition for a while now and researching it and trying to soak up everything that the group of advocates and experts and researchers, which you've just heard from, have been working on for years in order to come up with some ideas for what can be done at the enforcer level, at the AG level. And, the reason for that is, well, it's a big moment. It's a momentous time of opportunity, but also AGs have these huge array of tools and just a lot of different places where they can potentially make an impact. And so it's an exciting conversation to have. All right, I will first, what Terri and I are going to do and is talk really briefly about what we've learned in this research about what the term just transition can mean and how it's used. We have a very quick summary of the recommendations that we've been imbibing through all this research, and then we'll turn to what AGs can do. And then we want to sort of connect all those tools with our recommendations for AGs and ideas. But mainly we're going to get to big time for question and answer with these experts. So that's where we're going. Okay, I will start us with the definitions, then I'll turn it over to you, Terri. As we surveyed the literature, I just want to highlight that there's 3 strands to the definition of a just transition. First, the good jobs that you heard about, the need to make good jobs, the need to make jobs, good jobs in this new sector, and we're talking about energy, we're talking about the clean energy sector. It could apply to other areas too, when you're moving into this area, into a new sector. And the report has research on how to think about a good job too. And I'm excited about this research that Lara talked about. The second way people use this term is when they talk about the sector that the economy is moving away from. And there we're talking about humane support and assistance for workers in, for example, the fossil fuel sector, so that environmentally beneficial policies that might be contributing to that transition don't unduly harm the workers. And then third, a just transition also refers to the need to take the opportunity that's provided by the transition to right historic wrongs and direct the new jobs and opportunities towards marginalized communities and populations that have borne the brunt in a disproportionate manner of the pollution that came out of that sector. That's where we're moving away from. So there's just 2 caveats to keep in mind. We already heard some of this on one of them. As we learned, as we did this research, the term just transition, there's an issue with that term because there's not been a just transition. And so I think it's important to think about this in terms of what's needed for the just transition. It's not a foregone conclusion. It's a big project, and it's something where all these recommendations can hopefully contribute. And then second, if we're putting jobs and we're putting benefits from the new programs, the new economy into places where there are populations that have been disproportionately burdened by pollution, we also need to keep in mind the labor standards and make sure that we're not creating a bunch of jobs with low labor standards. So it's just a complicating piece of the puzzle. Okay, Terri, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So thank you, Bethany, and it's so great to be here with everyone today. And just to echo some of what I think you've already heard, one of the reasons we thought this was so important is just because it really is a pivotal moment, and it's a moment where we can see, there's a possibility of creating, high road, good quality jobs, or low road, degraded jobs with poor working conditions. And there's really the need to have a lot of focused attention to try and make sure that the former happens and not the latter. And so as we wrote the report, we thought about it, in terms of the clean energy sector, as well as in relation to fossil fuels and the sectors that are being phased out. And so we thought, what are the roles that AGs can play within these various sectors? So in terms of the clean energy sector, one important role is just to do enforcement, is to prioritize these industries for enforcement, to enforce the wage and hour laws, to enforce laws regarding misclassification. Misclassification is when employers or businesses, instead of treating workers as employees, they treat them as though they're independent businesses as a way of circumventing all of the workplace protections. And so this is something that has become more and more common, and that really degrades jobs in a lot of ways. So AGs can enforce, like I said, wage and hour laws, misclassification, and other kinds of labor abuses, including workplace safety and health as well. Another one of the major recommendations that just sort of comes up repeatedly that we've already heard a lot about is facilitating unionization. There's lots of evidence out there that unions, massively increase the wages of union members, wages and benefits. There's also lots of research showing that when there's high union density in an industry, that it actually improves working conditions throughout the industry, not just for members, because other employers have to compete in order to attract employees, and sometimes because they raise their conditions because they want to avoid a union drive. Unions also, although there is a really problematic history in relation to race and gender with unions, the demographics of union members are changing, and evidence shows that unions reduce racial and gender inequities in pay for union members. And then from the employer's point of view as well, and from the point of view of getting these projects done, using unionized work helps to reduce turnover, which can help get things done more quickly and efficiently. And so, but for workers from a just transition point of view, trying to find ways to facilitate unionization and to get these new jobs to be union jobs is something that most of the advocates and experts who are looking at these issues really recommend. And then there are some other tools that are among the recommendations of the experts in this space. Project labor agreements are sort of a big agreement that covers a whole project and sets rates, typically based on union rates, for an entire project. And it's a way to improve working conditions for that project and also to allow union contractors to participate. Prevailing wage laws set a higher rate for work that is done pursuant to a government contract. And the reason for that is so that bidders don't win a contract based on low road labor standards. And so that government uses its government funding and its contracting to drive good high road jobs, not bad jobs. There are also local hire and community benefits agreements, which are agreements where basically a developer or for a project has to agree with the community to create certain benefits for the community, like hiring people locally. So there are things that can be done in the clean energy sector, some of which there's a role for AGs in relation to. We'll talk more about the specific roles. But these are things that need to be done in order to create those good climate jobs in the clean energy sector. And I'll turn it over to Bethany for the next slide.
Thanks, Terri. Okay, just briefly through these recommendations, because we're going to get to our ideas in a second. There's so many programs and needs that need to be considered in the fossil fuel sector. And we're using the energy sector just as an illustrative example. But really what jumped out among all the recommendations is the need for a multifaceted plan. Relocation might not be possible, so training just isn't enough. And even if you're talking about training, what jumped out is that it should be training plus a job, or ideally it would be training plus a job. It's just an extremely complex project, and the plan needs to include relocation, training, and safety nets like early retirement. There's also an enforcement role here. There's statutes like the WARN Act and the Federal WARN Act, and then there are state level WARN Acts, which require an employer to provide notice to the workers before closing a plant of a certain number of days. And it's a certain number of days at the federal level, and sometimes at the state level, it's more. And so those need enforcement. That's an idea. And then there's in bankruptcy, there is a whole slew of needs. Okay, and that goes that starts before the bankruptcy even happens. There's the need to enforce the permits that the mine is operating under, and also enforce requirements. There might be requirements that the mine owner have a bond in place so they can pay pensions or pay worker salaries if they do go bankrupt. Those need to be enforced just as a regular matter, so that if and when a bankruptcy happens, there aren't a bunch of workers left without their paychecks. And I have up here the Black Jewel example from a couple of years ago. This company had mines in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, and they closed down, and I actually pulled worker paychecks back. And it led to a standoff. Workers were camped out on the train tracks to stop the last shipment of coal off the site. It's just a really like an example that highlights all the problems that can come from a bankruptcy. And we'll talk more about some recommendations in that sector. Okay. I think I'm turning it. Okay, well, actually, let me do quickly. Across these industries, there's also a number of recommendations. There's safety and health rules that apply across fossil fuel and across the clean energy sector that need enforcement. And another sort of pervasive recommendation that just is present in for any sector, and also, you know, along any of the definitions of a just transition, is collaboration, communication, coordination. And this is really about empowerment. The groups that are bearing the brunt of the policy shifts should be part of the decision-making. And then we wanted to highlight for you all this, this other aspect to this transition, and that is the growing need to clean up after climate disasters. And there's this organization called Resilience Force that is looking into the issues that have been caused by this new sector having to develop. It's a, you know, it's basically, just simply put, it's a crew of folks who go to places that have had a disaster and help with the cleanup, and it's rife with potential abuses. So it's something also to keep an eye on. It's another whole sector shift. Okay. Terri.
So many of the people who are here today work at AG's offices, but not everyone does. And even if you're in an office, you might not know everything, the totality of what AG's offices do, because people are often so focused on their own work. But AGs are actually really distinctive among government agencies in sort of the breadth of issues that they deal with and in the range of tools that they have available. And I previously worked in the New York State Department of Labor, and I also worked in the New York AG's office, in both instances enforcing labor laws. And what's interesting in an AG's office, among many other things, is they can enforce a range of different laws: antitrust, consumer, labor, environmental, whereas other agencies are often really limited to like the set of laws that are specifically within their jurisdiction. So, so what are the tools that AGs do? Their core work is, you know, they have a few elements that are their core work. One is representing state agencies in court. And in some cases, they also are general counsel advising state agencies. Another one of their core functions is enforcing state laws civilly and sometimes criminally as well. AG jurisdiction varies a lot. Some have really broad jurisdiction, some is very limited, but all of them have some kind of enforcement role and some kind of public advocacy role, where they're sort of bringing cases, standing up for the well-being of the people in their jurisdictions. They also often get involved in federal-facing issues. They file comments in relation to proposed federal rules. They might sue the federal government in some instances. They get involved in responding to or opining on federal legislation. Also, with regard to states, they get involved, again, they have an ability to propose legislation and to support legislation in most instances. In some cases, they issue opinion letters, which are sort of, you know, they're not really judicial and they're not really like laws, but they have a lot of sway in terms of expressing what the law is on a certain topic, and they can have a lot of influence. And then they also they have a lot of really powerful, you know, what are sometimes called soft powers. They have a very powerful sort of visible public position of leadership in the state, and can use their bully pulpit. They can author op-eds or hold convenings or do research and issue reports. They can, you know, do a lot of education of the public about their rights. And so there really is a range of different tools that they can draw upon in relation to this work. And so within sort of applying that range of tools to the just transition recommendations that we talked about. So starting off with unionization, there are some real limitations on what states and localities can do in relation to facilitating or promoting unionization, because the Labor Relations Act has strong preemption. And so that is one limit that state and local actors just all face. But nonetheless, state AGs can still play a role in educating workers about their rights to organize a union and their rights under the National Labor Relations Act. A recent presidential task force on worker organizing and empowerment recommended that just letting people know about their rights to have a union and how to organize is something that is so important, because people don't know this. And the U.S. Department of Labor recently launched a website that has a ton of information about this. So AGs could even, can do their own outreach about these rights, which would be very valuable, and obviously linked to the U.S. Department of Labor's website. They can also, when you develop relationships with unions, and when unions often find violations in the course of organizing workers, or if they bid on a contract and the unionized contractor loses to a sort of scofflaw who's violating a lot of laws, unions can bring cases to AG's offices, and AGs can build those relationships and can take very seriously those referrals from unions. Another really important role for AGs, and this is, their sort of main superpower, the thing that they can do that, many others cannot, is just enforcing the law. It is a pivotal moment. If there are violations in these industries, they can be prioritized in triaging cases. Whether they are overtime violations, misclassification, prevailing wage, whatever, discrimination, whatever kinds of violations there are. There's been a big emphasis over the past decade or so among labor enforcers in looking at strategic enforcement instead of just being reactive, being proactive, and being strategic about maximizing the impact and leveraging your limited resources to really deter violations. And usually people think about that in terms of the industries that have the highest rates of violation, but this is a different way of thinking about strategic enforcement, because it's strategic because you're trying to have an impact at this sort of critical moment when you might be able to deter violations going forward by setting an industry on a road that is compliant. There are other issues as well, enforcing safety and health laws where AGs have those powers. A lot of using those soft powers to highlight these issues, to urge legislation, creating good jobs. There's also a possible role in relation to the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is the big climate bill that just passed, and it creates really significant credits for contractors or that pay prevailing wage or use apprenticeship training programs. And AGs, for example, some AG offices that have been massively increasing their involvement in workers' rights have increased and have experience enforcing prevailing wage laws. And so trying to figure out a way that they could play a role in making sure that those contractors who are taking those massive tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act, making sure that they're actually following the law and doing what's necessary and paying their workers properly to get, to actually be entitled to those tax credits is important. And then finally, AGs can promote project labor agreements in various ways in advising client agencies. In some states, project labor agreements are not permitted, and so they can advocate for changing that. They can advocate for use of project labor agreements and enforce the terms if there's an enforcement role that AGs can play within the project labor agreements. So I'll pass it along to Bethany for the next slide.
Okay, I'm going to speed through this so we have time for questions. We have some ideas in the report for the fossil fuel sector too. Enforcement is one, very basic one. Collaboration and communication and building up partnerships that Terri mentioned is another. And then on bankruptcy, I'll just flag that, as I mentioned, enforcing the permit limits before bankruptcy is really important for purposes of the eventual plan that comes out of bankruptcy court, and also enforcing workers' rights. And in bankruptcy court, what we learned is that, the bottom line for the court and for the advocates in the bankruptcy proceeding is paying the creditors as much as possible, making them as close to whole as possible, not necessarily thinking about the pensioners and the environmental impacts of mines that are closing down. And the person or, the entity that's going to hold the bag for those things is potentially the state. And so that's the role for state AGs, is to enter those proceedings and play a role in speaking up with the workers and on behalf of the environmental cleanup that's going to be needed, so that the plan that comes out of the bankruptcy can provide for those really significant issues. Just briefly, there's a lot of crossover issues in environment and labor, and we've seen AGs active on these issues too. You know, the chemical disaster rule is a rule that EPA is considering right now, which would improve the safety protections at plants that deal in pollutants that can explode and hurt. And you know, that's an issue for the workers, that's an issue for the first responders. And if the rules are stronger, there'll be more protections in place. And EPA's analysis shows that the accidents would be hopefully less frequent and also less severe. There's also work that AGs are doing on heat standards, both federally and at the state level, to improve the standards for workers who are affected now with worse and worse heat waves. So those are just a couple of examples of crossover issues, and we've got more in the report. Terri, I know we want to talk about state and local enforcers, but we only have a few minutes left for questions.
Okay, I'll be super quick. I know I'll be super quick. So a lot of these recommendations are really relevant for other enforcers, not just state AGs and other policymakers at the state and local level. So prioritizing enforcement of workplace laws in these industries, supporting project labor agreements, community benefit agreements, making sure that new projects focused on climate goals also incorporate quality job requirements, educating people about their unionizing rights, and just using all of the tools that you have to address the current impact of climate change on workers, like Bethany was talking about, for example, the impact of excessive heat in the workplace. So I think that's the end of our slides, and maybe I'll turn it back over to TNR to open it up for questions.
Well, thank you, Bethany and Terri, for telling us a bit more about the report and explaining what tools AGs have in their toolbox to create a more just transition. Now we'll open up the floor to anyone who has questions for all four of the speakers. The chat is closed, but as we've mentioned, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. And we also always share this reminder, please remember to keep your comments respectful and stick to the topic at hand. Okay, so our first question here is, where should AGs and policymakers start? There are obviously a lot of recommendations in this report and lots of work that needs to be done on this front, but what should very first steps be it public-facing action or work behind the scenes? So I think I will send that to Bethany to start, and then maybe you can pass it around if anyone else wants to chime in.
Thank you, TNR. I just want to say one word. I mean, collaboration and empowerment. I think since it crosses all the recommendations, the AGs have this really great role they can play in public education and in bringing folks together, this convening role, that I think I would offer that up. But I actually want to hear from Lara and Dana about what they think should be the beginning of this work. I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, so I'm always going to uplift collaboration with community as a place to start. Not exactly related, but we are doing tours across the country related to Justice 40 in the context of IRA and the infrastructure package. We were in Austin and Houston last week, and there is such a dramatic difference between policy making at the federal level and what's implementable on the ground. And I think that when policymakers have really solid, strong relationships with communities and community-based organizations, it provides a wonderful opportunity to structure all of the things that we talked about in terms of best practices and opportunities in a way that will really benefit communities. Not to mention, organizations like ours have relationships, and we can be the broker, the liaison to help uplift issues, to help make meaningful connection, and to really arrive at solutions.
Yeah, and I would just add, I thought the list of recommendations that you all have developed is, spot on. A couple of things I would lift up is, there are states now that have standards in place. So I think enforcement of those standards is of utmost importance. I think thinking about how to expand those standards to other places and then enforce them, and looking at model legislation like the Illinois Climate and Equitable Jobs Act is a good starting point. And then the third thing I would lift up is, we just passed the most historic climate legislation ever in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, right? I mean, this is going to be a massive infusion of investment into clean energy activities, and what an important opportunity for us to dictate how these funds are going to be spent and how they help to build a diverse, inclusive, and equitable high road clean energy workforce and economy.
I would just add one last thing, which is that, there's no one size fits all answer with regard to different state AG offices, because they're all operating in such different landscapes in terms of their jurisdiction, their resources, the political environment they're operating within. And so I think, like, in addition to these issues of collaborating and sort of doing that listening tour with different and building relationships with organizations on the ground, some of it is just doing the landscape review of what are the laws in your state? What are the projects in your state? What's happening in your state that you can get involved in? And then again, I think the IRA is just really, really an opportunity. But to the extent there's so much public money going out, there's always interest in reviewing how is public money being handled, and our commitments that are made to get the public money, are they being actually honored?
And speaking of funding, we have someone asking, what state revenue streams have you found to be most useful to support wage replacement and relocation programs for dislocated workers? So I think I'll send this over to Lara and then Dana afterwards.
I mean, I would kick it to Terri and Bethany and Dana. I feel like I've done a lot of talking and you all have really been thinking about these issues.
I think the question about revenue streams is more of a policy issue than a law issue. I don't feel equipped to answer it. I don't know if anybody else does, but I think maybe this would be a good question for us to sort of get back and share when we circulate the recording.
Yeah, and I'll mention the report does summarize some state statutes that several states have passed, and they put money into the job of they put money into just transition. Like Colorado's got money that goes towards the communities and the cities and the places where plants are closing. And it's a start. It's a model to look at. I think just recently they put more money into it. It wasn't very money at first. Now there's more. And so they're doing this work of both identifying the communities and then putting money into solving the issues that are being caused by the closures in these communities. And that's, I think, a good place to look for models.
Well, we're coming up on 2 o'clock, but if we didn't get to your question, or if you have new questions that come up, definitely feel free to reach out to us. And I think we have time for one more lightning round question. So I'd love to hear from all of you. If you could tell us in one word or a short phrase, what's the most important factor to keep in mind in this work of creating a just transition? So I think I'll start with Terri, and then you can pass it around.
Wait, can you repeat the question?
Sure. So in one word or a short phrase, what's the most important factor to keep in mind with this work? Or if someone else wants to pipe up while Terri is thinking. Sorry, but you all.
Can I go first before my word is stolen? I think I would say justice.
Yeah, I'll expand on it. I was going to say we have to address legacy harms while setting people up for an equitable future.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go, Terri.
I was just going to say, I'm going to be snarky and just say, like, we have to be able to walk and chew gum. Like, too often there's this sense that, either we're going to have, a good, save the planet, or we're going to have good jobs, but like, we can't do both. And I think we have to, I think that, like, rejecting that false dichotomy and like why not both would be one that I would say.
That's great. I'm going to say empowerment. It's just incredible how much of a role that can play, how much of a beneficial role that can play. And so I'm going to put that out there.
Well, thank you all for those thoughtful responses and for participating today. That brings us to 2 o'clock. So I just want to say thank you to Lara, Dana, Terri, and Bethany for sharing your work with us today. And to our audience, thank you so much for your interest in this work. Please be sure to check out our report if you haven't already. And we'd also really appreciate your feedback on this event. So we've dropped a survey in the chat. Thank you all. We wish everyone a lovely holiday season, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Liv
you.
and Terri. Nice